Welcome to this special presentation of War in Copperhead Egypt. To be able to cover everything recorded in our book would take several hours, so to be more efficient, we're just going to skim the surface of what's contained there, hoping that I might give you, our audience, a sufficient overview of events that occurred here in southern Illinois during the time when the news was more focused on events in the southern states. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Ed Annable. My wife and I have been recording the history of southern Illinois for several years now. In 2025, in October to be exact, we published this book, War in Copperhead Egypt. It actually had its beginning in our former publication, Some Came Marching Home Again. Johnson County, Illinois went to war 1861 to 1865. That book was published in 2021. And we were told by one gentleman that said he had read a lot of books about the Civil War, but he never really understood it until he read our book. There seems to have been an effort to forget about all these events in our history. The evidence is real and it's easy to find. It seems like it all needs to be swept under the rug. It's a taboo subject, but we have the details here. The first thing we need to do is define Egypt before we go any farther so we know the area we're discussing here. Some have divided Egypt into two parts, the upper and the lower, but we consider all those counties south of the line on this map as Egypt. Some even call it Little Egypt, but we refrain from using this term because Little Egypt was a dancer, so we will refer to Egypt as this area shown on the map. What more defined Egypt and separated it from the rest of Illinois was its heritage. Most of the people in these lower counties had come from the lower states and still had strong ties to their families in the South and brought with them their culture. Many had come from the Carolinas and had moved across Tennessee and Kentucky before finally settling in southern Illinois. They had brought with them their feelings on slavery, as can be seen in this map of 1824. Illinois was on the brink of adopting slavery. Their neighboring state to the west, Missouri, was a slave state. Kentucky to the south and east was also a slave state, yet Illinois was not. We say officially Illinois was not a slave state, but Darrell Dexter in his book has shown us that slavery was in practice, yet officially, as we have said, Illinois was not a slave state. In 1824, the citizens had an opportunity to vote on this issue as seen on this map. The black counties, or the shaded counties, voted for slavery while the white counties voted against it. One interesting fact is that Johnson County, out of 146 people that voted, half were in favor of slavery and half were against it. Therefore, it's shown as, in quotes, not being for slavery. One other observation about this map is the dividing line where the pro-slavery people lived and the anti-slavery people lived. These lower counties made it known that they were willing to actually divide Illinois, with the southern counties seceding from the Union and joining the Confederacy. Newspapers took aggressive sides on these issues. It's interesting to read the opposing views in some of these different publications. Newspapers had a decided and advertised political agenda. These few newspapers here represent some of the many that brought the only news to readers across southern Illinois or across Egypt. Here is a list of some of those newspapers and the political views they represent. We need to look at politics here. There were three major political divisions in 1861. There was the Republicans, who were often associated with the abolitionists, those who were opposed to slavery. Elijah Lovejoy from the Alton area was an early leader in this movement. Black Republicans was a name often given to this party. The second group, and the one who seemed to make the least amount of noise in all the news, were the Union Democrats. These were the ones who were in favor of preservation of the Union. The third group, the most vocal, represented a large portion of southern Illinois, or Egypt, and these were the Copperhead Democrats. Their objective was to avoid the war, and if they were forced to choose sides, they favored the Confederacy. They were more willing to help the Confederacy in any way that they could. Their enemies were not only the Republicans, but the Union Democrats. This group, without any real organization, acted often spontaneously, with their only intention being to be a disruptive force and a hatred toward anything Union. It is strange that one of the counties that was most aggressive toward anything pro-Union was Union County. There was, in the midst of all this, an aggravating group, the Knights of the Golden Circle, or the KGC as they were often known. This was a large organization that had its beginning in Indiana and had several strong organized groups here in southern Illinois, especially in Williamson, Perry, and Jackson counties. Their objective was to create a new country known as the Golden Circle. This country would have included the Confederate States as well as Mexico, Central America, and a part of South America. There were many well-known political figures in southern Illinois that held political ties to this group. At one of their meetings held in the dark of night, at a meeting near Tamaroa in Perry County, a mole had embedded himself with this group. And a full disclosure of their activities appeared in the Chicago Tribune of August 25, 1862. It began in a sensational manner with the headlines reading, "Treason in Illinois, the Knights of the Golden Circle, full and authentic expose, a congressional traitor smoked out." The full article covered this much space in the Tribune, and is too lengthy to read here. As a result of this article, several people were arrested, as shown here. Some very prominent names were arrested and imprisoned in the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C., with many being released later. In all fairness, we need to mention that one author wrote about their false arrests, as he put it, and imprisonment in a book that's published in 1877 known as The American Bastille. It's a very interesting book. George W. Smith wrote A History of Southern Illinois, a popular 3-volume set published in 1912. Gathering information about the KGC, he asked people in the counties of southern Illinois if there had been any KGC organizations in those counties. He discovered that there were members of the KGC in most of the counties. Several of the counties did not respond, of course. The presidential election of 1860 shows the several counties and how they voted. Lincoln, of course, was a Republican candidate. Stephen A. Douglas was a Democratic candidate. John Bell was the Constitutional Union candidate. And John C. Breckinridge was the choice of Southern states Democrats. This was before the Confederacy split from the Union, so these Southern states had their favorite candidate. With this in mind, the Union County vote might give some indications of where they stood. Although most of the county voted for Douglas, as was the case for most of southern Illinois, Union County cast almost as many votes for the southern states candidate, the Confederate candidate, favored by the South. The Emancipation Proclamation presented another problem to Egypt that was struggling with whether to support the war or not. The war in the beginning was about preserving the Union, but suddenly those who wanted to preserve the Union didn't want to free Negroes. This was the predominant attitude in the area in regard to Negroes. Two of the most outspoken newspapers on the issue of allowing free Negroes into Illinois were the Jonesboro Gazette and the Cairo Gazette. Both of these newspapers, Copperhead newspapers we might call them, published articles that declared their pure hatred toward Negroes. The Jonesboro Gazette called them a horrible nuisance. The Cairo Gazette said that the levees were so dark with Negroes pouring in that a person had to carry a lantern with him in daylight. Well, what about these Copperheads, the ones we've been talking about? We have defined them politically, but now we have to define them in practical terms. Copperhead was a collective term used to describe the Knights of the Golden Circle, as well as those who did not choose to be a part of that group, but had the same ideology. Many were drawn into the activities of the KGC unwittingly. They seemed to have a natural hatred toward Negroes and were cheering on the southern states and doing everything they could to be a stumbling block for the Union. Their outward appearance was that of one of the good old boys. They had no real organization, but sometimes wanted to be recognized when they met another Copperhead. The common penny in that time period was the large cent. They would cut the head from the coin and either mount it on a pin or carry it in their pocket as a way of making it known that they were Copperheads. These badges were worn by both men and women. We could name several news articles concerning their activities in our area. Here's some that seem to be most important. One accused the sheriff of Johnson County of kidnapping a free black Negro and selling him as a slave. Then there's another one. Some black children in Pope County were kidnapped and sold to a man in Mississippi. They were eventually found and returned home. Here's another Pope County article. There was a preacher by the name of West who was accused of being an abolitionist. His family was attacked one night, but they survived to tell the story. We cover all this in our book, but it's too lengthy to expand upon right now. These are the Copperheads, often admired by their neighbors. There were two infamous infantry regiments from Illinois, and we say infamous referring to the fact that the legacy they left famous as it was not a good legacy. The first is the 109th, which is probably the worst of the worst, mostly because of their leadership. This regiment, raised mostly in Union County, were pure Copperhead, except for Company K, which was raised in Pulaski County. They were the example of a Copperhead regiment. They joined so they might avoid the draft, but their loyalty was with the South. Their adjutant, basically the record keeper, was also editor and owner of the Jonesboro Gazette, and that is the one that we call a Copperhead newspaper. The Chicago Tribune published this story on January the 26th, 1863. We'll not read it all, but here's a portion of it. It's quite lengthy. Our readers have heard strange stories about a mutiny in the 109th Illinois Regiment, and its being disarmed and officers and men placed under arrest after first being deprived of their arms. The story, in a shorter form, states that the 109th, made up mostly men from Union County, was full of members of the Knights of the Golden Circle with the exception of Company K. They were from Pulaski County. General Grant suspected that this regiment was up to no good, and when they were encamped near Holly Springs in northern Mississippi, he sent a spy dressed as a Confederate officer into the countryside to speak to the farmers there. The 109th had let it be known that they wished to be attacked so that they could surrender and give up their arms to the Confederacy. Grant put a stop to it by placing the whole 109th under arrest. We might say here that they were later reinstated and their arms returned to them, but the whole regiment was eventually disbanded, and those willing to fight as Union soldiers were absorbed into the 11th Infantry Regiment that had lost so many men early in the war. There are those who are adamant about defending the 109th, so we give a certain section of our book in regard to that. I need to mention here one of our most valuable resources. It was an anonymous writer that called himself the Wandering Yankee. He had some intimate relationships with the people in Union County and often wrote about them, but always keeping his identity secret. We have searched everything with the signature of the Wandering Yankee, and we are yet to identify him. I will say that some of the information gathered from this writer can be found nowhere else. In 1866, almost a year after the war was over, that Wandering Yankee again published a story in the Centralia Sentinel on March 22, 1866. He said, "Not a soldier of the 109th or 128th Regiment is anywhere to be found. If we meet one of them and inquire what regiment he belonged to, he will invariably give the 11th or some other loyal regiment. No one will ever own having belonged to these rebel regiments." Now let's take a look at the other rebel regiment, as it was known, the 128th Infantry. The 128th Illinois Infantry was Williamson County's disloyal unit in this war. This regiment seemed to have been molded and influenced by some of the political leaders in Williamson County. They reflected the values of some of those men. Josh Allen was one of those political figures. It will be sufficient now to say that his speeches in the county most likely had a great influence on the actions of the 128th Regiment. The Illinois State Journal of January 23rd, 1863 had this to say about the 128th. The 128th Illinois Regiment, Colonel R. M. Hunley, now here, is very much demoralized. Its report today shows 393 absent without leave and 44 fit for duty. Another newspaper, the Woodstock Sentinel, that's a Northern Illinois newspaper, published this on March the 18th, 1863. Another Democratic Copperhead Regiment has been discovered. It is the 128th Illinois, commanded by Colonel Hunley and recruited in Williamson County. The colonel and all his men were KGCs, and all have deserted, save 72 rank and file. They carried off, with the connivance of their commander, their muskets and ammunition. This regiment was eventually disbanded, and also with some of the loyal Illinois soldiers sent off to fill vacancies in other Illinois regiments. Now let's take a look at an interesting incident that occurred in Union County. And again, the Wandering Yankee was very helpful in this. This Wandering Yankee tells the following about events in Union County. About Christmas 1862, a systematic course of aggression was commenced, which was calculated to strike the Union men in their most vulnerable point. Several valuable peach orchards were destroyed in a single night. As these orchards all belonged to Republicans and were situated in different parts of the county, it is evident that the outrage was preconcerted and done by several different parties. There were several arrests made for desertion in Union County. The provost marshal sent a man by the name of Thompson to arrest deserters, and as he was about to board the train to take them back to Anna, a mob attacked him and rescued the deserters. The officer, of course, released the men. The story was picked up by the Chicago Tribune on April the 16th, 1863, as follows. Today, at about 1 o'clock, a mob of 40 men, armed with revolvers and a rope, rescued 2 deserters from the custody of an officer at Anna, Union County, near Jonesboro, on the Illinois Central Railroad. They threatened to hang the officer if he did not comply with their request, and he was compelled to surrender. They then took his revolvers away from him and allowed him to depart. The Jonesboro Gazette published its own story about the account, but it was called out by the Illinois State Journal, April 20th, 1863, with the following headline and a portion of that story. The affair at Anna, Copperhead account of it. The Jonesboro Gazette, a malignant Copperhead concern, which has advanced step by step in treason with the KGCs and Jeff Davisites of Southern Illinois, denies the statement made by telegraph in reference to the alleged rescue of 2 deserters at Anna a few days ago. There's another incident that occurred in relation to this arrest of deserters in Anna, and this is where the Dug Hill Ghost had its origin. The Chicago Tribune article of April 17, 1863 sets the stage here. Their headlines were, James Welch, who assisted the arrest of deserters at Anna, killed. further from the Anna rebels. A loyal man murdered. The mob that rescued the deserters at Anna yesterday pursued one of the men who arrested them, a Mr. Welch, overtook him on his way home, shot and wounded him, and then beat him to death with stones. We might add here that this incident happened at Dug Hill, and that's the origin of the Dug Hill ghost story that has been prominent throughout Union County. Of course, the Jonesboro Gazette published its own account of this incident, stating that no one knew how Mr. Welch had died and that he was a man of bad character from the Preston area of Union County. The Wandering Yankee, the one we have mentioned earlier, published his account of the story, stating that he believed that the murder of Welch had been sanctioned by the leading men of Union County. All of these events did not go unnoticed by the authorities at Cairo. The events at Jonesboro began to change as this April the 29th, 1863 article from the Chicago Tribune states. The next day, a company of Iowa soldiers came up from Cairo by special train and reached Anna, 1 mile from Jonesboro, to which place they proceeded, but when they arrived, every man of the town, containing 1,200 inhabitants, had fled, and they could do nothing. They returned the same night to Cairo, but the next day they came up on the regular passenger train at 3:00 p.m., and going over at once, they surrounded the business part of town before the alarm was sounded, and at once proceeded to make arrests. They took possession of the courthouse, and no one was allowed to leave the town. And farther down in this same article, it reads, about 20 of the principal men were sent to Cairo, and day before yesterday, something like the number were added. They will be forwarded to Columbus, Kentucky, where they will be tried and sentenced, or furnished transportation into Dixie, where they belong. They include the businessmen of the town and their miserable, drunken, Negro hunting, swearing, foul-mouthed hangers-on. Some of the former are wealthy, and the physicians and lawyers are well represented. And again, reading from that same article a little farther down, the following is the condition of the people through the county. One sees men riding horses at full speed along quiet roads and with guns on their shoulders. Formerly, runaway slaves used to fix up lodging places in the woods or in caves where they were stopped to rest a few days or for the night. Many of these identical lodges are occupied by the men who formerly hunted them. They band themselves together and live in large barns, keeping watch night and day and having guns always loaded. But when the soldiers come, they flee. If possible, they dare not shoot. Some sleep in hollow logs, others cannot sleep anywhere. Often one comes across a dozen or more camping in a remote valley. Now let's take a look at Williamson County, another hotspot for the war in Copperhead, Egypt. Here's another article from the Chicago Tribune. We'll read a portion of that. This is from June the 30th, 1863. You have undoubtedly fresh in your mind that fact, patent to all who have occasion to travel through that section of the country, that Williamson County is the nest and present hiding place of a gang of desperadoes and cutthroats of the Copperhead species, not to be equaled in bloodthirstiness by the guerrillas of the South or the bandits of Spain or Italy. This county, if it had been hoped by all loyal men, would not resist the draft, would not place the least bar between the people and the demands of the government in the way of conscription. Felicius Hope. In 1863, there was a registration for the draft, a type of census of men eligible for military service and subject to a draft if need be. Speaking to those who have done extensive research in some of our county courthouses, you may have come across what appears like a census, but it is a registration of all the men who were eligible for the draft in 1863. I don't recall ever finding this in Johnson County, where I've done most of my research, but I do recall seeing this in Pope County. Williamson County apparently did everything they could to avoid this registration. As a result, the city of Marion was placed under martial law. Liquor sales were stopped, and anyone wishing to leave the city would need a pass from the provost marshal. To obtain a pass, a person would have to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. One of the most prominent political figures in Williamson County was William J. Allen, or Josh Allen, as he was most often known. In 1862, he had been arrested for treason as one of that group of KGC members that came as a result of the report on treason from that publicized secret meeting in that field near Tamaroa in Perry County. When martial law was declared in Marion, Josh Allen was required to take the oath before he was allowed to leave that town. Look at this article from the Chicago Tribune of July 31, 1863. Martial law has been declared in Marion, Williamson County. Josh Allen, who is there, refused to take the oath, and the provost marshal refuses to let him out unless he does. So he has made himself a prisoner. Williamson County had a great many deserters and protected them against arrest. Not everything coming out of Williamson County was opposed to the war. John A. Logan was prominent in that area and received fame for his actions to support the Union. So we have to give Williamson County credit for that. I could continue to bring you many more stories of the Civil War within Egypt, but time does not allow me to do so. In closing, I will mention one more incident that we found while researching the war in Copperhead, Egypt. In our book, we call this the Aiken Affair. The story actually comes from the Chicago Tribune of April the 12th, 1864. We'll not read that, but we'll give you some of the details. This incident began in White County near Carmi. One night, a stranger stopped at the house and asked permission to spend the night. During the night, a band of men disguised as Negroes attacked the house there and robbed the family living there of about $600 to $800 and murdering the residents there. The man who had spent the night before aided them in this endeavor. Neighbors soon found out about it and began to track the murderers to a house between Marion and Carbondale belonging to a man by the name of George Aiken. They arrested Aiken and found that he had been quartermaster of the 128th Regiment, that infamous regiment of deserters from Williamson County. He had a reputation of being a leading man in the Knights of the Golden Circle. When they arrested Aiken, they found that he had made off with a large amount of army clothing, blankets, and other goods belonging to the government. From the newspaper we read, Aiken was secured and his captors started upon their return. But it is reported that they arrived home without their prisoner, who has not since been heard from. It is believed that being fully convinced of his guilt, those having him in custody concluded to anticipate the slow process of law and accordingly hung their prisoner. And this from the Chicago Tribune of April the 12th, 1864. For the past 15 months, many Union men have been waylaid and assassinated or murdered in their own houses, their furniture carried off, families subjected to innumerable annoyances. There is not much more I can say about this war in Copperhead Egypt, but I will say that most of this has been lost to history. Most of this has been swept under the rug until we have published this book.